I'll let my parents live in this house. You can't even cook, so leave LOL. Mark came up to me with a smile as if he was saying I did it, and said something so outrageous that I was left speechless. There is no way that I would allow them to live in my house and then try to move in with my in-laws without my permission, and try to evict me, the owner of the house. I'd been taken aback by Mark's controlling nature for a while, but now it feels almost sickening. I just can't go on with Mark anymore. Feeling this way, I decided I would make Mark pay. My name is Sarah, a housewife in my 40s. I live with my husband, Mark. Mark is what you'd call a house husband, and while he doesn't work, he takes care of the household chores that I can't manage because I'm working. In return, I go out and work to bring in the money we need to live. All of this is to lead a stable life with Mark, but all my efforts seem to be in vain. Mark has a pretty domineering personality. It's not that I think there's anything wrong with being a stay-at-home husband, or that men should work, but even though he's not working, he behaves as if he's the man of the house and protects it. I'm so tired today. I want some ice cream. Go buy it for me. Out of the blue, he'd say something like that when relaxing in the living room at 11 p.m. The convenience store isn't too far away, but I had a tough day at work and was exhausted, so I was irritated by his entitled attitude. Why don't you go get it yourself? It's just a short walk to the store. I replied in a colder tone than I intended. That's how much Mark's behavior annoyed me. However, when I refused, Mark chuckled and said, "You think that's how you should behave? You never know what'll happen if you upset your husband." Mark has always been the kind who would say things like, "I'm the man of this house, and I protect it, so you need to respect that." Honestly, I'm frustrated with Mark acting superior and expecting respect just because he's the husband, even though he doesn't work. Every time he behaves this way, I feel tormented and don't want to engage with him. At that moment, I thought if I continued dealing with Mark on top of my already stressful job, my stress would become unbearable. So I said, "I'm really tired, I'm sorry. I'm going to rest in my room." But Mark didn't seem to like my attitude and stopped me, saying, "Wait. What's with that attitude towards your husband? I could kick you out right now if I wanted to. Do you think it's all right to upset your spouse like that?" He looked angry. Who does he think he's kidding, acting like the boss when he doesn't even work? He can upset me whenever he wants, but heaven forbid I upset him. It's just like a child's tantrum. I'm sorry, but I'm really exhausted. Please understand. I didn't even want to talk anymore, so I said that with a forced smile. Mark sighed deeply and muttered, "You're such a disappointment as a wife." At this point, I didn't have the energy to argue, so I just said I'm sorry again, and retreated to my room. Day by day, I was worn down by Mark's overbearing behavior. But I didn't have the energy to confront him about it. That's how exhausted I was. Then one day, I caught a bad cold. The doctor said it was stress-induced fever, and the first thing that came to my mind was Mark. I was so sick that I couldn't move, so of course, I took a day off from work and could only lie down in my bed. When I told Mark about my condition, he snapped, "A cold? That's just an excuse. Go to work, you're useless." His words seemed to make my fever spike even higher. Moreover, he added, "I won't be taking care of you. This is your mess, deal with it." So I was left alone in my room, moaning from the fever. There were no ice packs or anything. I was too weak to prepare anything for myself, and I didn't want to face Mark again for fear of more verbal abuse. My temperature reached 103 degrees Fahrenheit. The fever was so high that my body was so overcome with sweat that I could not even get up to change my clothes, even when they were wet. I thought, how much easier would it be if I could just pass away? With these farts, I endured a painful night alone. Maybe it was the fever, but I couldn't sleep at all. Even when the sun set and it was time to see the night sky, feelings of loneliness and doubt if this was all right overwhelmed me, and it was unbearable. I actually wanted Mark to help. Not necessarily to bring down my fever or anything. I just wanted him to get me an ice pack, bring a cold compress, and say, "Are you okay?" But that was just a fantasy I had. The words I actually received tore at my heart, leading to new anxieties that tormented me. Why must I be the only one to feel this way? What did I do wrong? Why can't things go well with Mark? Once these farts started, I couldn't stop the tears. It was just so painful. After about 3 days of rest, my fever finally subsided, and I was able to return to work. My colleagues and bosses were concerned, asking, "Are you sure you're all right?" But my health was improving, and more than anything, I had to support the household. When I mentioned that I couldn't afford to take more time off, they seemed even more worried. Their kindness, which was so much more than the attitude I received from Mark, brought tears to my eyes. I guess my emotional breaking point was close. A voice inside me was screaming that I couldn't deal with Mark any longer. I was ignoring that, pushing myself too hard. This way of life wouldn't last forever. Someday I'd reach my limit and wouldn't be able to get back up. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I know that, but that didn't mean I could even have the presence of mind to deal with the situation before I reached my limit or to do so. By this time, my affection for Mark had already faded. But I didn't have the room to think about starting preparations to live our separate lives. How could I clear these feelings? With these worries, I worked hard every day, came home exhausted, and was swung around by Mark's whims. I lived such days every day. One day, while relaxing in my room, Mark called out, "I have something important to discuss. Come here." It had been a long time since we had a serious talk. Usually, Mark wouldn't inform me about various things and would make significant decisions on his own. So, with a sinking feeling, I wondered what this was about. As I sat down for the discussion, Mark, with an excitement I'd never seen before, said, "I'll let my parents live in this house. You can't even cook, so leave LOL." The first word that slipped out was, "What?" "You need to leave because you're living with my in-laws." I couldn't accept the reality due to his utterly selfish remarks. But regardless of how I felt, Mark continued to push the conversation forward. He wanted to change the name on the deed so that this house belongs to him and his parents. He wanted to divorce me and start a new family. He stated that this was already decided and that nothing I said would change that. I felt dizzy at the decisions made without considering my feelings. When I brought up the idea of living together, my parents were happy. They must have missed me. I need to be there for them since I'm the man of the house. Mark, who was full of himself with the term man of the house, could only think of his own needs. There was no way I could continue with Mark anymore. My heart told me it was absolutely impossible. Oblivious to my feelings, Mark chuckled. "You love me so much, don't you? I know it's shocking to hear this from the husband you love so much. But I'm sorry, I just want to take care of my family. Please understand." Mark spoke in a tone as if he was admonishing me. But I wanted to retort, "That's not true at all." I didn't have a shred of affection left for Mark. What was left was my disbelief at Mark's overly selfish actions, and my regret for not cutting ties with him sooner. Why didn't I end things with him much earlier? If I had done these earlier, Mark would not have taken advantage of me so much, and he would not have been so selfish and arrogant. I even despised my past self for being too weak and not having the guts to let Mark go, thinking I was too overwhelmed. Mark seemed to misunderstand, thinking I loved him too much and didn't want a divorce. Of course, that was far from the truth, because my feelings for Mark had cooled a long time ago. All that remained was disgust for Mark, who seemed to think I still cared for him despite his actions. To make my feelings clear, I spoke up. "I'll leave then." At those words, Mark exclaimed, "What?" He probably didn't expect me to agree to a divorce and to leave so easily. He should brace himself. Mark's in for a rough time ahead. And the foolish me who used to bail Mark out is a thing of the past. From now on, no matter what happens to Mark, I won't help him. Because we won't be a couple anymore. Seeing my determination, Mark looked shocked and frozen in place. I took this opportunity to head to my room and pack the essentials. I won't be able to take larger items today, so I probably need to hire movers later. As I was heading out, Mark approached hurriedly and said, "Are you sure about this? If we divorce, we'll be strangers." I replied with a smile. "I've already fallen out of love with you. I feel so much lighter letting go of what's not needed." Hearing this, Mark stood there, looking lost. I gave a nod, saying thanks for everything, and left the house. Mark had a worried look on his face. Then, I went back to my parents' place and explained everything. My parents were furious with Mark's behavior, ready to give him a piece of their mind. But once they learned I had a plan, they calmed down. I began to recuperate at my parents while handling various matters. First was the divorce. After sending the divorce papers, I received a message from Mark. "Are you sure about this? I don't know if it's really a good thing, but I don't have any feelings for you Ichi anymore, and if we've gone this far and he says there's no divorce, that would be a problem. I feel so much better now that you're gone. So fill out the divorce papers quickly." When I sent him that message, there was no reply. A few days later, I received divorce papers with the sections Mark was supposed to fill out already completed. I quickly filled in my parts and submitted them to the county office the same day. Now, Mark and I are complete strangers. I no longer need to support the household as Mark's wife. During the divorce process, we also split our assets. As Mark declared, the house became his, so I changed the ownership to his name and decided to give it up. From the beginning, we got this house because Mark was insistent, saying I want this house. It wasn't really comfortable for me anyway, so it was just a burden to me. Instead, I decided to get alimony from Mark. Since Mark isn't working, his parents covered it. But it seems he's actively job hunting now, probably planning to pay them back once he gets a decent job. But reality doesn't always go as planned. A month passed since the divorce was finalized, and I moved out of my parents' home into a new one, living a peaceful life. Then, I got a call from Mark. Honestly, I found it annoying. I immediately figured out why Mark was calling. But ignoring him might lead to more problems. I'd have to talk to him sooner or later, so I decided to deal with it now for my own future's sake. "Hello. What do you want after all this time?" I was utterly fed up with dealing with Mark. I wanted him to hurry up and finish whatever he had to say. As I reluctantly answered the phone, he pleaded, "Please help me." His desperate tone made me laugh. I expected Mark to be in a tough situation, but I never imagined it to be this bad. "Well, what happened?" "LOL, you have to tell me or I won't know." "LOL. I actually had a hunch about why Mark was in such a mess, but I wanted him to spell it out. When I pressed him, Mark hesitantly began to explain, stumbling over his words occasionally. He had taken over the house from me and lived there just fine for a month. But recently, he had to pay the rent. Since Mark was still unemployed, and I was surely able to cover the expenses with my own earnings, he decided to ask my former parents-in-law, who were living on a pension, to put up the payment for him. But the amount on the bill was much more than they expected. It was around $1,800. There was no way the retired in-laws, living off their pensions, could afford that. My former in-laws were furious, saying, "This is not what we heard." They were furious and blamed Mark terribly. Lost and unsure of what to do, Mark called me in tears, asking for help. I had no idea the rent was so high. "The place is a mess now. What are you going to do about it?" Mark was now blaming me, in frustration. Sure, it was my mistake for not mentioning the rent beforehand, but it was Mark's foolishness for trying to take over the house without even knowing the monthly cost. You could say he brought it upon himself. He treated me like an outsider and pushed me away. And now, this was the outcome. Despite the results of his own actions, he couldn't accept it and instead reached out to me for help. I couldn't help but sigh at his audacity. But, without paying attention to how I felt, Mark continued, "Please, I need your help. We can't go on like this. I need you." The urgency in Mark's voice reflected their dire situation. Surely, they must be feeling really cornered right now. I'm pretty sure the rent due date has already passed, so they might already be behind on the rent. The owner of that house is short-tempered and would not tolerate even a month's delay in rent payment. I remembered being told multiple times when I rented the house, never be late on the rent. If they've missed a payment, they're in for a rough time from the owner. Mark has met the landlord once or twice, so he knows all too well how intimidating they can be. Messing with them could be irreparable. So, he was probably desperate when he called me for help. "Please, just cover the rent for 1 month. I don't have anyone else to turn to. You still care about me, right? If someone you care about is in trouble, you should help them out," Mark said, still acting selfishly. What love? My feelings for you have long since faded. I wanted to say those words to him, but I held back and said, I'm sorry, but don't I have any obligation to help you? It was Mark who cut me off, wasn't it? But you want me to help you when you're in trouble. Don't you think that's too convenient? I coldly replied. It was a genuine sentiment, no pretense. That's how much feelings of frustration and despair towards Mark welled up inside me. Yet Mark defended himself. Please, don't be so cold. I really can't do this without you. Whether you still love me or not doesn't matter now. We used to be married, right? Can't you help me out just this once? No. You were the one who left me. And even before all that happened, my feelings for you had already cooled. It's been a long time since I stopped loving you. When I said that, I could hear Mark's dejected voice on the other end of the phone. I can't believe it. For so long, I endured everything. Even when Mark acted selfishly, or took me for granted, or treated me poorly when I was sick, I stayed by his side, trying to make our marriage work. I worked hard for the life we had together. And this was the result. Why didn't I leave sooner when my love for him faded? Why didn't I distance myself from Mark earlier? These regrets were flooding in, along with the anger I felt towards him. Mark never truly faced me. He never showed concern for me, never tried to protect me, and never considered walking through life hand in hand as a couple. All this time, he's treated me like a mere maid, like a machine just to bring in money. Every time he acted that way, he was oblivious to my despair. Yet, even though all this is a result of Mark's doing, he comes pleading for help as if to say, I'm the victim here. His attitude seems so self-centered that it's off-putting. Please, help me. I'm begging you. How about we get married again? This time we'll start over properly. I promise I'll never kick you out again. I couldn't help but chuckle at Mark's desperate proposal. Remarry to you? Are you kidding me? All of this is the result of your own actions. I have been trying to work with you in my own way for a long, long time. I kept trying to make you face me. Now you're telling me to start all over again with you, pretending that all of that never happened. Do you want me to go back to those hellish days? That would never happen. I'm not going back to that life no matter what. I got so worked up that tears began to flow. I couldn't tell if they were from anger or sadness. Mark said nothing in response to my words. Unable to bear any more of this conversation, I simply said goodbye and hung up. Mark didn't call after that, and wanting never to hear his voice again, I blocked his number. I later heard from mutual friends that Mark and his family got evicted from their home. Mark, in his own way, tried to talk to my former in-laws and somehow get them to pay the rent on his behalf, but they were furious and said, "That's not what we talked about," and refused to pay the rent. As a result, they upset the landlord and had no choice but to leave. Mark hasn't had much luck finding a full-time job, so he's working part-time to make ends meet. Apparently, because they had been living together, the in-laws had to sell their house and are now cramped in a run-down apartment, all three of them. As for me, I've been so engrossed in my work that my boss discussed a promotion with me. It seems I might be the first female manager in our company, and I've received looks of admiration from both colleagues and juniors. Sometimes friends ask, "Aren't you going to get married?" To be honest, after being forced into that kind of life, I have quite a negative image of marriage. The idea of dating a man or getting married again doesn't appeal to me. But life is long, and there's no need to rush. In this generation, many people go their entire lives without getting married. If I can live my life without regrets, that's all that matters. If I can live true to myself, that's enough. With that in mind, I want to continue walking through life at my own pace.